Hey guys, today we're diving into a topic that's both scandalous and scientific. It's the world of medieval sex, a world full of mystery, taboos, and rules that now feel almost alien. A world where foreplay didn't mean candles or whispered secrets. It meant hoping, praying that no one else in the room would be watching. We live in an age where sex is everywhere. On screens, in music, in advertising. You can swipe right, send a message, and meet someone in minutes. Privacy is built into our homes. Bedrooms lock, curtains close, bodies are celebrated, or at least accepted. You have choices, freedoms. But imagine a world where sex wasn't just hidden, it was regulated, restricted, and whispered about only in the shadow of fear. A world where you couldn't close a door, where you didn't even have a door, where your marriage was a contract, not a choice, and your body belonged more to the church than to yourself. This was the reality for millions in medieval Europe. And tonight, we're going to peel back the layers and step into that world. Raw, cold, candlelit, where desire had to fight for air. Let's begin. In medieval life, privacy didn't exist the way we understand it today. For most people, especially peasants, the family home was just one room, just one. There were no separate bedrooms, no locked bathrooms. You ate, worked, slept, and had sex in the same space. Your parents, your children, the goats, all under one leaking roof, the kitchen, the bed, and the stable. Sometimes they were the same corner. The idea of a private moment was laughable. Couples would whisper in the dark under scratchy blankets, hoping their movements wouldn't wake a neighbor or a sibling. In fact, many medieval texts describe how children grew up learning about sex not from stories, but from the muffled grunts and creaking beds just feet away. Even among the upper classes, privacy was limited. Lords and ladies might have more space, but their rooms were rarely empty. Servants came and went. Visitors were hosted in shared chambers. Estate records often kept track of who slept where and with whom, not out of curiosity, but out of duty. The bed itself was political, and when nobles traveled, they didn't book a private suite. Inns were communal spaces. You might find yourself squeezed between two sweaty strangers on a mattress stuffed with straw. It wasn't just awkward, it was expected. If you thought monasteries might offer peace, think again. Monks and nuns slept in rows, watched constantly by superiors. In female convents, towering walls weren't built for safety. They were built to suppress temptation. The body was a threat. Pleasure was a sin. Yet the most powerful presence in your bedroom wasn't your spouse. It was the church. Sex, according to religious law, was only allowed within marriage. And even then, only for procreation, not for love, not for pleasure, certainly not for fun. Church leaders, theologians, and bishops wrote extensive rules about when sex was acceptable and how it was to be performed. Sundays, forbidden. Lent, forbidden. Advent, also forbidden. Wednesdays, Fridays, and all holy days, you guessed it, forbidden. There were over 100 days a year when sex was banned. If you followed the church calendar strictly, intimacy was something that had to be scheduled. And even when it was allowed, the rules didn't stop. Couples were advised to show restraint. Too much moaning? Sinful. Too long? Sinful. The missionary position was considered the only acceptable way. Anything else was considered animalistic, or worse, demonic. Passion was dangerous. Intimacy was suspicious. Desire was a temptation to be fought, not followed. And then came confession. If you broke the rules, even unintentionally, you were expected to confess it to a priest, in detail. Did you have sex on a holy day? Did you think about someone who wasn't your spouse? Did you enjoy it too much? These were real questions. Priests were trained to ask, and you had to answer. The confessional was not a safe space. It was surveillance with incense. The church used it to enforce doctrine and reinforce guilt. Sinners were given penance, sometimes prayers, sometimes fasting, sometimes public shame. But here's the strange part. Enforcement was uneven. Among peasants, especially in rural villages, most people ignored these restrictions. They had to. Their lives revolved around the rhythms of farming, not fasting. They needed children to help with the work. They didn't have time for theological schedules. Among nobles, though, it was different. Their appearances mattered. The church's gaze was heavier. A noblewoman could be ruined by rumors. A nobleman's marriage could affect alliances, land, and inheritance. And so came the marriages, cold, strategic, and emotionless. Love was not the foundation of medieval marriage. It was often irrelevant. Daughters were exchanged like property to build alliances. Sons were matched with girls they'd never spoken to, often never seen. These were not unions of hearts. They were transactions. Romance, if it existed at all, came later, if it came at all. Courtship was strictly monitored. Love letters were rare. Flirtation was discouraged. Any expression of affection had to be subtle and safe. A brush of the hand, a shared glance. That was all you dared. Still, some dared more. There were those who fell in love outside of their arranged marriages, who shared stolen moments in stables or gardens, who exchanged poems and promises. But they did so at great risk. Adultery could mean ruin, especially for women. The church tried to suppress lust with doctrine, but lust didn't care. It found cracks in the walls, and it crept through them. People didn't stop having sex. They just stopped talking about it. And yet, the strangest part of all this is that there was a calendar. Yes, an actual calendar that marked the days when sex was permitted and when it was not. These calendars were copied by monks, distributed to parish priests, and sometimes kept by noble households. They told you exactly when you were allowed to have sex and when you weren't. You didn't own your time. You didn't own your body. You followed the rules, or you confessed. Sex wasn't just intimate. It was institutional. The church didn't just moralize it. It managed it. But even in this world of restrictions, desire lived on. People still longed, still touched, still broke the rules. There were men who loved men, women who loved women. There were affairs, secret pregnancies, even love triangles and cuckoldry. Not because medieval society accepted them, but because human nature always finds a way. And this is only the beginning. Because in the next part, we'll talk about chastity belts, brothels, public health, and medieval contraception, or lack of it. So stay with me, dim the lights, let your breath slow, and remember, history is never as clean as we pretend it was. The truth? It's always messier and far more human. Let's continue. Last time we left behind the darkened rooms of medieval homes, the silence, the rules, the confessions. But there's more, so much more. Because while the church tried to dictate the moral boundaries of sex, the streets of medieval towns told a different story, a louder one, a dirtier one, a more human one. But before we go there, let's talk about a myth, one you've probably heard, the chastity belt, that strange metallic symbol of possessiveness and control. A device supposedly locked around a woman's waist when her husband went to war, to ensure her purity in his absence. You see it in cartoons, in movies, in satire. But here's the truth. There's no reliable evidence that chastity belts were ever used in the Middle Ages. None. Historians believe the idea originated much later during the Renaissance, likely as a joke, a piece of erotic satire, or a product of moral panic. The iron contraptions displayed in museums today, most are 19th century inventions. They were never worn. They were built to shock, to moralize. In reality, medieval society didn't need metal underwear to enforce fidelity. It used something much more effective: shame. A woman's reputation was everything. Her family's honor, her marriage prospects, her value. If she strayed, even emotionally, the consequences were devastating. She could lose her dowry, be cast out, labeled forever as unclean. Fidelity wasn't enforced with locks. It was enforced with surveillance, social control, and religion. The fear of disgrace did the work. And yet, behind that wall of fear, sex was everywhere. Take the brothels. Yes, you heard that right. In many medieval towns, prostitution wasn't just tolerated. It was legalized, organized, regulated. City councils issued licenses to brothel owners. They designated red light districts, usually outside the city gates, near the docks or far from churches. These areas were known, patrolled, and visited. Why? Because city leaders, especially male ones, believed that a controlled outlet for sexual desire reduced crime and prevented greater sins like adultery or rape. Some officials even argued that legal brothels protected the morality of good women by redirecting male lust elsewhere. And so they created a system. In some cities, there were appointed officials whose job was to oversee the brothels, not to shut them down, but to manage them. These men, often called keepers of the peace or similar titles, kept records, inspected conditions, and ensured that the rules were followed. Ironically, while the church officially condemned prostitution as a sin, many churchmen turned a blind eye to its existence. Some even visited. Hypocrisy, like sex, was not in short supply. Inside the brothels, things were structured. Women who worked there did so for different reasons, some by choice, often due to poverty, some by coercion. Others were orphans, widows, or runaways with no alternatives. For some, it was survival. For others, it was forced. These establishments weren't lawless dens of chaos. Many followed written guidelines. Sheets had to be clean. Regular health checks, crude and inconsistent by today's standards, were sometimes enforced. Services were priced according to category, quick, standard, or luxury, depending on what the client could afford. Clients came from all walks of life: merchants, soldiers, travelers, even nobles. Sex in the brothel was transactional, but it was also revealing, because it peeled back the layers of medieval society and showed what people really wanted behind the veil of piety. And what they wanted wasn't always what the church taught them to want. But let's step back for a moment and ask something simple. How clean were these encounters? Because the truth is, medieval personal hygiene was a very different concept from what we know today. Bathing was rare, not because people didn't want to be clean, but because soap was expensive, hot water was labor-intensive, and space was limited. Most peasants might wash a few times a year. Water was cold. Heating it took firewood. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, and often reserved for clothes, not skin. Public bathhouses did exist in towns and cities. At first, they were places to relax, wash, and even socialize. But over time, many bathhouses gained reputations for illicit activities. The church, always wary of temptation, began shutting them down. Others closed due to disease outbreaks or scandals. With the decline of bathhouses, cleanliness declined too. And yet, the human body still craved contact. Desire didn't vanish just because people smelled like smoke, sweat, and mud. It just adapted. This brings us to a fascinating and deeply uncomfortable part of medieval sex: contraception. Yes, it existed. No, it wasn't reliable. Some women tried herbal mixtures, recipes passed from midwives and healers. These often included pennyroyal, rue, or wild carrot seed. Some of them worked slightly and dangerously. Other methods were more imaginative and much less effective. Animal intestines were sometimes used as rudimentary condoms, not common, not cheap, but known. Animal membranes, especially from lambs, could be washed, dried, and reused. Risky? Absolutely. But in a world where pregnancy meant permanent consequences, people took chances. Some rituals included magical chants or talismans, not because they were proven, but because people were desperate. Contraception, according to church law, was a sin. To prevent pregnancy was to defy God's will. To interfere with creation was to risk damnation. But fear doesn't always beat biology. People continued to experiment, to hope, to fail. And when those failures came, when a young girl found herself pregnant before marriage, the consequences were swift. Sometimes the couple was forced to marry. Sometimes the girl was shamed, exiled, or worse. Sometimes the child was abandoned. The stigma was immense. In a world without safe abortions, without social services, an unwanted pregnancy could ruin a life. And yet, sex went on. It slipped past the rules. It mocked the sermons. It whispered in the dark corners of brothels, behind monastery walls, and in the homes of both peasants and kings. Sex, the act itself, didn't change. What changed was how society treated it. In our world, access to birth control is considered a right, a choice. But in medieval Europe, it was a secret, a gamble, a sin. And that tension between instinct and institution shaped everything. It shaped marriages, shaped cities, shaped souls. But it didn't stop people from wanting, from touching, from trying. And in the next part of our journey, we'll talk about what happened when they did, before marriage, what the rules were, what the punishments were, what virginity really meant, and what society feared the most. Because the deeper we go, the more clearly we see. Medieval sex wasn't just about control, it was about survival. In our world, sex before marriage is common, talked about, explored, sometimes celebrated, sometimes criticized, but rarely life-altering in the way it once was. In the Middle Ages, it was different, much different. Intimacy before marriage wasn't just a personal choice. It was a social risk, a dangerous one that could cost you your future, your reputation, or your life. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. In truth, sex before marriage was far from rare. People are people. They get curious. They fall in love. They make mistakes. And back then, just like today, they often did so before any rings were exchanged. But in medieval society, the consequences were severe. Local authorities kept a close eye on courtship. Couples caught in compromising positions could be fined, and the fines varied depending on the circumstances. If a pregnancy resulted, the punishment became more intense. Sometimes marriage was forced. A quick ceremony meant to fix the damage. Other times, the woman was blamed entirely. Whispers spread fast. Reputation was everything. A young girl labeled impure might never marry, and without marriage, her future vanished. No dowry, no protection, no children, no survival. For peasants, this meant hardship. For noble families, it could mean ruin. The stakes were even higher when it came to virginity. Today, the idea of virginity is debated, its value, its meaning, its relevance. But in the Middle Ages, virginity was a currency, especially for women. It was something to be guarded, proven, and presented like a seal of honor. In marriage contracts, especially among nobility, a woman's virginity wasn't just expected, it was required. Her purity was a political tool, a guarantee, a promise that her children would be legitimate, that no other man's blood had tainted the family line. And so virginity became a legal matter, something worth inspecting. Yes, inspecting. Proof came in many forms, some humiliating, some horrifying. Witness testimony, blood-stained sheets, invasive physical examinations. These weren't myths. They were procedures, documented and accepted. For noble girls, even the hint of premarital intimacy could destroy everything. For peasant girls, expectations varied. A lapse might be overlooked if a wedding followed. But for the rich, the powerful, the stakes were absolute. But the world wasn't as black and white as the priests made it out to be. Because while heterosexual marriage was the law of the land, human desire refused to be boxed in. Same-sex relationships existed, quietly, carefully, but undeniably. The Church condemned them harshly. Official doctrine declared homosexuality a grave sin, a crime against nature. Punishments varied from penance to death, depending on the region, the power of the accused, and the severity of the act. But the people, they were more complicated than the laws. There are letters, poems, even court records that reveal deep, emotional, and often romantic bonds between men and between women. These weren't always sexual. Sometimes they were simply love, a love that couldn't speak its name, a love hidden behind religious allegory and poetic metaphor. In monasteries, both male and female, these relationships often flourished, quietly, tenderly. In isolation, the heart finds connection. Monks made vows to one another. Nuns shared dreams. There were no words like gay or lesbian, no labels, just longing. In male cloisters, intimate friendships were called spiritual brotherhoods. They involved letters, prayers, and lifelong devotion. In female convents, women formed what they called particular friendships, bonds so strong they often wrote of them in the language of marriage. Was it sex? Not always, but it was intimacy, affection, companionship in a world that otherwise demanded silence. And then there was adultery. The medieval world treated marriage not as a bond of love, but as a legal contract, a strategic alliance. Cheating didn't just threaten trust, it threatened property, inheritance, power. If a noble woman bore a child that wasn't her husband's, It could tear kingdoms apart. And so adultery was punished. For women, the consequences were brutal. If discovered, a wife could lose her dowry, be thrown out of the home, branded as unfaithful, shamed in the town square. Her options, already few, could vanish overnight. Men, their punishments were lighter. A nobleman might face a fine, a priestly scolding, a slap on the wrist. Sometimes nothing at all. But the real danger wasn't legal. It was personal. Because in a world where honor mattered more than justice, betrayal could lead to blood. Honor killings weren't uncommon. A husband who discovered his wife's infidelity might murder her or her lover and face little consequence. Among the nobility, such acts were sometimes expected, a way to cleanse dishonor. In cities, public penance was a tool of shame. A woman might be forced to parade through the streets in her underclothes. A man might have to kneel in front of the cathedral and beg forgiveness. And yet, adultery happened, repeatedly, constantly. Passion, like nature, does not obey rules. In private letters, we find evidence of longing, forbidden touches, rendezvous in gardens, affairs that lasted years or ended in scandal. Some noble women maintained secret lovers. Some noblemen kept mistresses in towers or hidden apartments. Others paid off priests and guards to stay silent. Behind every stone wall was a heartbeat, and behind every heartbeat, a story. Cuckoldry existed. It wasn't named, but it was known. The fear of it haunted men, especially the powerful, because if your wife cheated, the child might not be yours. And if the child wasn't yours, your legacy wasn't yours either. And yet, women took the risk, some out of love, some out of desperation, some just to feel something real, something theirs. And still, the church preached, the sermons warned, the confessors listened. But in taverns, in corners of castles, in the stillness of monasteries, love broke the rules. Because medieval sex wasn't just about power or reproduction. It was about the same thing it's always been about, the need to feel seen, to feel wanted, to feel alive. And that's what we'll explore next. In Part 4, we'll step into the murky realm of consent, what it meant, what it didn't, what the courts decided, what the literature revealed, and how the church tried to navigate a world that kept slipping through its fingers. But for now, close your eyes. Let the past settle like dust in the torchlight. We've only just begun to uncover what lay beneath the silence. What does it mean to say yes? Today, we speak of consent as a clear, essential part of intimacy. But in the medieval world, yes wasn't always a choice, and no wasn't always an answer. Marriage itself was seen as a contract, not just between two people, but between two families, two estates, two bloodlines. Love wasn't necessary. Consent was negotiable. The church did teach that both bride and groom must agree to the union, at least in theory. A forced marriage, they said, wasn't valid. But here's the truth. For noble women, consent was often a formality, an expectation. By the time a marriage was arranged, the girl, sometimes just 12 or 13, was already locked in. Her opinion didn't matter. Her voice was a whisper drowned beneath the roar of politics and property. And once inside the marriage, consent became even more ambiguous. Sex was seen as a husband's right, a wife's duty. Refusing could be grounds for annulment. In some cases, refusal was considered spiritual rebellion, a failure not only as a wife, but as a Christian. There were no laws protecting women from marital rape. The idea didn't exist. The bedchamber was a kingdom, and the husband ruled it. What happened there stayed there. But sometimes the boundaries were crossed so violently that even the law intervened. Medieval courts did handle cases of coercion, of assault, of abuse, but the outcomes were rarely just. A nobleman might bribe the court. A peasant woman might be ignored. A girl's testimony might be dismissed unless a witness, a male one, could corroborate her story. And of course, shame followed the victim more than the perpetrator. Still, stories made their way into the literature, not as accusations, but as cautionary tales, as tragic romances, as twisted fables, poems told of women trapped between love and duty. Songs mourned the girl who trusted too deeply. Legends whispered of knights who took what was not freely given. In these stories, the word consent isn't always spoken, but its absence echoes loudly. It's strange, isn't it, that in an age so obsessed with morality, so consumed by the rules of sex, the most important rule, willingness, was the least protected. The church, meanwhile, continued its balancing act. It promoted marriage, but discouraged desire. It encouraged procreation, but condemned pleasure. Sex, they said, was permissible, but only within very strict limits, and always with restraint. Moderation was the virtue. Passion was a flaw. To be celibate, the church taught, was to be closer to God. Virginity was sacred. Marriage was tolerated. Lust was dangerous. Clergy who broke their vows of celibacy faced disgrace, but not always punishment. Some bishops had mistresses, some priests had children. The church knew, but preferred not to see. Meanwhile, ordinary people were told to abstain, to suppress, to suffer. And yet, love found a way. Even in the coldest corners of medieval life, the heart refused to be silenced. Peasants fell in love. Courtships bloomed among the haystacks and under moonlit trees. Boys carved initials into fence posts. Girls wore garlands of flowers made for them at dawn. It wasn't poetry, but it was real. Among the nobility, affection had to wear armor, but it still existed. Knights wrote verses to distant ladies, women they could never touch, never kiss, but whose names lit fires in their souls. These women were untouchable, sacred, worshipped from afar. It was the age of courtly love, devotion without consummation. Or at least, that's what the songs claimed. Tales of tragic lovers filled the halls. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, forbidden, doomed, beautiful. And in this strange contrast between expectation and emotion, some couples chose love, yes. Even in this world of arranged marriages and political strategy, there were those who married for love. Not many, but some. The church, in its surprising way, supported this. It required that both bride and groom give verbal consent out loud at the ceremony. Without that, the marriage was invalid. And so, in those rare moments when two people truly wanted each other, it was allowed. It was real. Letters between spouses show tenderness, kindness, partnership. Some wives were more than property. Some husbands were more than owners. They were companions, lovers, friends. One letter from a nobleman to his wife reads like a modern love note. "I miss the sound of your voice," he writes. "I count the days until I hold you again." Another wife, writing from a distant manor, signs her letter with a pressed violet. "For your heart," she writes, "forever." These moments, though rare, break through the cold record of medieval history like shafts of light through stained glass. Reminders that even in the darkest times, love is possible. So we ask again, what did consent mean? Maybe not what it means now, but somewhere, in whispered vows, in secret letters, in stolen glances, people were saying yes, even when the world around them kept saying no. And that's what we carry forward, because next we'll take a very different path, away from romance and into something far more philosophical. We'll meet a man named Zeno, a shipwrecked merchant who lost everything and found a new way to live. We'll explore Stoicism, a path of discipline, detachment, and inner peace. Because while medieval love burned in secret, ancient wisdom burned quietly in the background, waiting to be rediscovered. But for now, rest. Let the fire fade. Let the noise of the past settle like ash. The night is long, and there's still so much more to tell. Let's go back even further now, back before the cathedrals, before the confessionals, before even the empires that tried to shape morality and law. Back to a man standing alone on a shore, watching the last of his wealth sink beneath the waves. His name was Zeno, a merchant from Cyprus, and he had just lost everything. A storm had swallowed his cargo. Gone were the goods, the hopes, the future he had charted across the sea. And yet, in that collapse, something strange happened. He found a new path. He stumbled into Athens, broken, lost, and there he discovered philosophy. He began to sit at the feet of thinkers, questioners, rebels of the mind. Among them, Crates, a man who owned nothing, wore rags, and mocked power. Crates didn't build systems. He destroyed illusions. He taught Zeno to strip away the need for wealth, the fear of loss, the pain of ego. And in those ashes, Zeno planted something new. He began teaching in the Stoa Poikile, a painted porch in Athens, a simple place open to wind and passer-by. It was from this Stoa that the philosophy got its name, Stoicism. It was not cold, it was not lifeless, it was calm, measured, resilient. It taught that the world, the entire universe, is governed by a divine reason, a force they called the Logos, not a god of thunder or vengeance, a principle, a logic, a structure beneath the chaos. You can't control what happens to you, Zeno said, but you can control how you respond. You can choose virtue, no matter the storm. Pain, it will pass. Loss, it's inevitable. Death, certain. But your character, your decisions, yours. Stoicism was born not from luxury, but from ruin. And Zeno wasn't alone. Others followed. There was Cleanthes, a man of immense patience. He carried water by night, studied by candlelight. When Zeno died, Cleanthes took his place, not because he was the smartest, but because he lived the philosophy. To Cleanthes, emotion wasn't the enemy. It just needed to be in harmony with reason. Feel deeply, but never be ruled by what you feel. Then came Chrysippus, the logician, the architect. He turned Stoicism from a loose code into a full system, ethics, physics, logic. He believed that if you mastered your inner world, the outer one could never break you. Together they shaped a school of thought that endured not just centuries, but empires. In Rome, Stoicism became more than philosophy. It became a way to live and rule. Seneca, the advisor to Emperor Nero, wrote letters on self-discipline, humility, time. His words, soft and severe, warned that wealth corrupts if left unchecked. And yet, Seneca was rich himself, a contradiction that tortured him. He preached simplicity while dining among gold. Then there was Epictetus, once a slave, crippled in youth, freed by luck. And yet he spoke of freedom not as something granted by men, but something found within. No man is free who is not master of himself, he said. He taught that true power came not from status, but from sovereignty over the soul. And then the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, a man raised in palaces, burdened with empire, surrounded by war, betrayal, and grief. And still he turned inward. In the dark hours of his life, he wrote to himself, not to others, not to history, but to the flicker of his own resolve. He called them meditations. Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about others, he wrote. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Death smiles at us all. All a man can do is smile back. He ruled a world on the edge of collapse, and yet he sought no comfort in glory, only in principle. He lived Stoicism more fully than perhaps any man before him. But after Marcus came the unraveling. His son Commodus abandoned the virtues his father held dear. Where Marcus wrote with restraint, Commodus lived with indulgence. He fancied himself a god, a gladiator, a spectacle. The empire rotted, and Stoicism faded. It became a memory, a whisper in the libraries, a tool for monks and scholars, not citizens. The rise of Christianity brought a new focus, not self-mastery, but divine mercy, not inner reason, but heavenly grace. Some Christian thinkers respected the Stoics. They called them noble pagans, admirable but incomplete. They shared values, humility, temperance, endurance, but differed in foundation. Stoics looked inward. Christians looked upward. Still, Stoicism left its mark. Its writings survived, copied, preserved, buried in monasteries. In the margins of illuminated texts, monks scribbled translations of Epictetus. In sermons, traces of Zeno's logic echoed, even when his name did not. Centuries passed. Then, in the 20th century, something changed. Philosophers like Pierre Hadot rediscovered Stoicism not as theory, but as practice, a daily discipline, a way to endure modern chaos with ancient calm. Writers like Ryan Holiday brought it to the masses. Books like The Obstacle is the Way made Stoicism accessible again, not for kings, but for workers, students, athletes. Today, we turn to Stoicism in podcasts, in therapy, in quotes on gym walls, because the world is noisy, fast, unstable, and in that storm, the voice of Zeno still speaks. You are not your success. You are not your failure. You are only how you respond, only what you choose. Virtue, the Stoic said, is the only true good. Fame, wealth, pleasure, all externals. None can be relied upon. All can vanish. But courage, wisdom, justice, temperance, those are yours to carry, always. And in that, there is freedom. So now, as we step from philosophy back into history, remember this. Before religion told you how to feel, before society told you how to live, there were men who taught you how to be strong, not with swords, but with silence, not with conquest, but with character. And in our next chapter, we'll explore another world where body and soul collided, the Roman baths, places of water, of heat, of community, of whispers and politics, of healing and sin. But for now, breathe, and like a Stoic, let go of everything you cannot control. Imagine this. You step into a marble hall, your bare feet cooled by stone polished by centuries. Steam curls around you. Light filters through a high domed ceiling, dancing on the surface of warm, quiet water. Welcome to the Roman bathhouse. But this isn't just a place to wash. It's a temple, a theater, a whispering chamber of politics, poetry, and pleasure. It's the beating heart of a Roman city, and it's unlike anything the medieval world would know for centuries. In modern life, we think of showers as private, routine, functional, a few minutes before work, a rinse before bed. But in Rome, bathing was a ritual, a social performance, an act of public identity. Men and women, though usually separately, came to the baths not just to clean themselves, but to exist, to be seen, to talk, to listen, to live. Each complex was massive. Think of a modern spa crossed with a university, a food court, and a political convention center. There were rooms of every temperature, the apoditerium, where you undressed, the tepidarium, warm and calming, the caldarium, blisteringly hot, full of thick steam, the frigidarium, cold, sharp, bracing, and pools, basins, private corners, and people, always people. But beyond the sensual experience, these places were technological marvels. Romans engineered the baths with a level of precision that still stuns modern architects. Beneath the floors ran the hippocaust system, a network of hot air channels fueled by roaring furnaces. The floors were lifted on brick columns, heating the stone above. Walls had hollow bricks to carry warmth upward. The ceilings were vaulted to trap heat. The walls were insulated. Water was cycled through massive aqueducts, gravity-powered, purified by elevation and care. They had no electricity, no pumps, no modern materials, and yet they created a system that allowed thousands to bathe daily, to sweat, to swim, to soak, in perfect comfort. Even the acoustics were engineered. Domes scattered sound in deliberate patterns, creating privacy zones or echo chambers, depending on the room's purpose. But this wasn't just hygiene, it was community. In the baths, senators and soldiers sat side by side, poets and prostitutes, freedmen and merchants. The rules of class softened, if only slightly, under the haze of steam. You might strike a business deal while rubbing oil on your arms. You might recite a verse while being massaged with a mixture of crushed herbs and olive paste. You might overhear gossip about an emperor's scandal while floating weightless in a marble pool. This was the Roman public square, naked, literal, unapologetic. Food vendors offered snacks, olives, bread, figs, salted fish. Musicians played lyres and flutes. Acrobats performed flips on the stone platforms. Teachers gathered students for informal lessons. Even libraries were housed inside bath complexes. After your soak, you could sit down and read philosophy. Doctors operated in private rooms. Philosophers gave lectures. Men debated law. Lovers exchanged glances. Friends argued sports. The bath was where Rome breathed. And yes, there were darker corners too. Rooms where arrangements were made, where lovers met in secret, where desires that had no place in polite society were quietly explored. The Roman bathhouse was a paradox, a place of both health and hedonism, sacred and profane, and it was for everyone, almost, because even here inequality remained. The wealthy arrived with slaves who carried towels and perfumes. They had access to private chambers, could pay for extra services. Their bodies were massaged with rare oils, their backs scrubbed with imported sea sponges. The poor bathed too, but later in the day, when the water was cooler, the floors dirtier, the attention less generous. Women, in many cases, bathed separately. But some emperors, like Caracalla, allowed mixed bathing. Scandalous, the Senate declared. Popular, the people replied. Some bathhouses had strict rules, others turned a blind eye. It depended on the city, the mood, the ruler. But one thing was constant. These baths were symbols, symbols of Roman identity, of progress, of power. Wherever Rome spread, from Britain to Syria, the bath followed, in stone, in design, in ritual. To be Roman was to bathe, but even the greatest steam eventually cools. As the empire decayed, so did the baths. The aqueducts crumbled, the fires died, the marble cracked, maintenance stopped, the roar of furnaces fell silent. Inflation, war, political chaos, all drained the empire of the energy required to keep the water hot. And as Christianity rose, so too did discomfort with the naked body. Public nudity, once mundane, became shameful. Bathhouses were seen as sinful, dangerous, places where lust flourished, where morality drowned. The church began to close them or repurpose them. A hall of water became a convent. A bath turned into a cathedral foundation. In time, the great complexes stood empty, moss growing in the corners where once philosophers debated eternity. But the memory didn't die. In the Islamic world, the bathhouse lived on, reborn as the hammam, a sacred and social space. In medieval Europe, spas emerged slowly, cautiously. The idea of public bathing returned piece by piece. Today, we try to recreate it in steam rooms, saunas, spas, but we never quite recapture the scale, the spirit. Because Rome didn't just build bathhouses, it built experiences. It built a culture of cleansing, yes, but also of connection, where the body wasn't hidden, where water wasn't just water, where architecture itself was an offering to the senses. And so, when you next hear the sound of dripping water, or feel warmth spread through your skin in a quiet shower, remember them. The voices in the steam, the hands in the oil, the minds that tried to find peace in the noise of the world. And next, we'll travel somewhere older still, to the land of pyramids, of papyrus, of gods and wounds, to a place where medicine was magic and healing began with a prayer. We're going to Egypt, but for now, rest. Let the warmth of the bath follow you into sleep. Before the scalpel, there was the spell. Before the syringe, the sacred oil. Before medicine became science, it was something more. Tonight, we leave behind the steam of Roman baths and step into a different heat, dry, relentless, holy. We walk along the Nile, beneath stars that watched over gods and men alike. We enter a temple, and inside we find a hospital. Because in ancient Egypt, healing didn't happen in clinics. It happened in sanctuaries. In a world where God shaped the wind and fate was etched in stars, medicine was not separate from religion. It was guided by it, held in its hands. Doctors were more than doctors. They were priests, interpreters of divine will. Their tools were herbs and hymns, diagnosis and divination. To understand Egyptian medicine is to accept a strange, beautiful paradox. They were among the most advanced physicians of the ancient world, and yet they never let go of the magic. Let's begin where it all began, with the body. Egyptian doctors knew it well. They studied its rhythms, its wounds, its secrets. They listened to the pulse, examined the skin, watched the breath. They didn't have X-rays or microscopes, but they had observation. Generations of it, passed down in ink and parchment. They consulted dreams, read symbols. Sometimes they turned to the stars. Astrology wasn't entertainment, it was diagnosis, a way of mapping the invisible tides that moved through blood and bone. Their treatments mixed natural and supernatural, a poultice of honey and myrrh for wounds, a chant to drive out the spirit of disease, both used together, both believed to work, and they documented everything. The Eber's Papyrus, over 700 remedies, a catalog of suffering and its solutions, written in elegant script, stored in temple libraries, copied by scribes with reverence, each recipe tailored to status, symptom, and situation. Many of these treatments were real, effective, antiseptics like honey, anti-inflammatories like willow bark, garlic for blood, juniper berries for digestion, laxatives, painkillers, sedatives. Others, less so. Crocodile dung, lizard's blood, hippo fat, powdered mummy. Ingredients strange to us, but not to them. Because in a world without germ theory, symbolism was as important as substance. To eat the strength of a beast, to absorb the spirit of a god, that was healing too. They used minerals, natron to dry wounds, copper to clean infections, oils of lotus, castor, black cumin, rubbed into joints, poured into wounds, breathed into lungs, and with each medicine came a prayer, because the drug, they believed, had no power without the incantation. The voice was part of the cure, the intention as important as the ingredient. They believed in Heka, the sacred force that linked magic and medicine. A healer without Heka was powerless, and so, when you lay on the table, you weren't just a body, you were a soul in struggle, a battlefield of seen and unseen forces. Even surgery existed. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, named for the man who bought it, not the one who wrote it, describes 48 cases, head injuries, fractures, dislocations, each one with methodical precision. Doctors knew how to stitch, to drain abscesses, to set broken bones. Their tools, bronze knives, needles, scalpels, were sharp, clean, and often blessed. They cleaned wounds with honey, washed them with beer or resin, packed them with herbs. They knew inflammation. They saw infection. They treated pain with poppy extracts, the ancestors of morphine. Their patients survived, sometimes, and when they didn't, the work didn't end. Because in Egypt, death was a transition, not an end, and preparing the body for the afterlife was medicine of another kind. The embalmer was a priest and a surgeon. He washed the body with Nile water and palm wine, removed the stomach, liver, lungs, intestines, stored in sacred jars. He reached through the nostrils to draw out the brain, a substance Egyptians thought less important than the heart. The heart was sacred, the seat of thought. If it decayed, the soul could not be judged. Sometimes a scarab amulet was placed in its absence, a symbol of rebirth. Then came the natron, a drying salt. 40 days it absorbed all moisture. The body shrank, preserved. The skin tightened like parchment. The mouth was sealed. The eyes replaced with stones. And then the wrapping, layer upon layer of linen, each fold recited with spells from the book of the dead, prayers for safe passage, for transformation, for eternal rest. By the end, the corpse was no longer a corpse. It was an offering, a vessel, a story. And through this ritual, the Egyptians preserved more than flesh. They preserved memory, and more than that, they preserved science. Because when the Greeks came, Hippocrates, Galen, they studied the Egyptian texts, translated them, argued with them, built upon them. The cradle of Western medicine rests on the foundation of Nile and scroll. Even today, echoes remain. We still use honey in wound care, still seek balance in our bodies, still fear the invisible, still hope for the healing touch. Modern hospitals may be sterile, fluorescent, fast, but their roots, painted with oil, inked with prayer, wrapped in linen and carried across desert sand. And as we move toward the end of our journey, we begin to see the pattern. Whether in medieval Europe, imperial Rome, or ancient Egypt, the body has always been more than biology. It is a symbol, a battlefield, a mystery. And in our final chapter, we will explore how these mysteries come to rest. Because after medicine failed, after breath ended, there remained one final act, a ritual of preservation, of devotion, the making of a mummy. But for now, let your body rest. You are safe, you are whole, and the ancient world will still be waiting when you wake. The body lies still now, dried, emptied, cleaned, quiet. But the ritual is not over, not yet. 40 days have passed. The natron has done its work. Moisture is gone. Decay has been denied. But death is still watching. So the embalmers begin the final phase. With sacred oils they anoint the flesh, oils of cedar, myrrh, lotus. Their hands move slowly, carefully, whispering prayers as they go. The body is wrapped in linen, strip by strip. Each fold is placed with intention. Every layer contains a spell. A name is spoken. A future is imagined. The face is veiled. The heart, if missing, is replaced with a scarab, a symbol of rebirth, of morning after night, of life after death. And then, at last, the mask is laid. Gold for royalty, painted plaster for others, a human face, eternal, unblinking, ready to meet the gods. This is not just embalming, it is belief, woven into fabric, hope, wound around bone. To the ancient Egyptians, the body was more than biology. It was the temple of the soul, a vessel for eternity. If it was preserved, then so too was the spirit. The perfect body meant a perfect afterlife. But this wasn't superstition. Not entirely. This was knowledge, care, precision, observation. This was medicine, in ritual. Because even in death, the Egyptian physician did not vanish. His scrolls remained. His ink endured. The Ebers Papyrus, with its 700 remedies, still stands as one of the oldest medical texts in the world. Its pages speak of tumors, infections, parasites, birth control, heartbreak. They contain instructions, precise, practical, poetic. Apply this poultice at dawn. Speak these words. Wait 3 days. Observe. There is patience in those pages and respect. Then there is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, perhaps more modern than medieval minds ever were. It contains no magic, only anatomy, injury, procedure. It speaks of the brain, the spine, the pulse. It is the earliest known surgical document in history. 48 cases, each one described, treated, evaluated. This is a case I can heal. This is a case I can fight. This is a case I cannot save. Honesty, discipline, wisdom, and the Kahun Papyrus, dedicated to women, to fertility, to childbirth, to pain. It lists remedies for miscarriages, for difficult labor, for menstruation. It shows that Egyptian medicine did not ignore the female body. It listened. Their doctors saw women not as vessels for sons, but as patients, as people. And the knowledge didn't stop at the Nile. When Greek thinkers rose, when Hippocrates wrote of humors and Galen dissected animals, they stood on Egyptian shoulders. They read their scrolls, argued with them, built from them. Ideas moved from temple to academy, from papyrus to parchment, from North Africa to Europe. The roots of modern medicine grow from Egyptian soil, and many of their practices still echo today. They understood the importance of cleanliness. They sterilized with beer, salt, honey. They knew which herbs soothed, which burned, which healed. They made balms and salves still used in home remedies around the world. They believed the mind influenced the body, that fear could sicken, that calm could cure. Their doctors were not only healers, they were mentors, guides, interpreters of pain. They spoke not just to illness, but to the soul behind it. And in that, they were ahead of us, because modern medicine often forgets the whole. It breaks us into symptoms, scans, codes. But ancient Egyptian healers knew you are not just a wound, you are not just a fever, you are story, memory, meaning. The healer must treat the invisible as carefully as the seen. And in that belief, we find something precious, something we've only recently begun to rediscover. Holistic care, integrative healing, a return to the idea that wellness is more than survival. It is balance between body and spirit, between science and care, between knowing and believing. So as we close this journey, what have we seen? We began in the cramped, cold rooms of medieval peasants, where sex was hidden, punished, distorted. We walked through monasteries where love whispered in silence. We watched philosophy rise from shipwrecks and echo through emperors. We bathed in the steam of Roman marvels, felt the pulse of community, heard the gossip of senators in towels. And now we leave the ancient sands of Egypt, where healing meant prayer and preservation meant immortality. Through it all, one truth emerges. The body has always been more than flesh. It has been feared, worshipped, punished, celebrated, silenced, saved. And those who touched it, whether to love, to heal, or to bury, carried the weight of generations. So tonight, as you lay in your own quiet room, warm, safe, clean, know this: you are part of that story. Your heart beats in rhythm with centuries of others. Your body is your own, but its history is shared. Rest now. Let the ancient world fade into the background. Let the lights dim. Let the walls of time fall quiet and sleep, with the memory of those who touch the living with reverence and the dead with love.